All right, my name is Johnny Burtka, and I'm the president of ISI, and I'm happy to welcome you to our second panel, which started out as a panel to assess the state of conservatism, but there have been so many panels on where conservatism is headed, where it's going, that I thought for a second we would call it not another panel on the future of conservatism. But then as I was pondering what on earth am I going to call this, Sam published a wonderful book called After Nationalism, Being American in an Age of Division. And Sam is actually the literary editor of Modern Age. Dan is the editor-in-chief. So this is really a editor's panel. And something that we're really trying to do more consciously at ISI this year is to integrate Modern Age into our student programming. I think we've got two of the sharpest thinkers on the right represented in Dan and Sam, and they complement each other's perspectives so well that we want to bring it into our student programming. We'll have a Meet the Editors panel at our honors conference this August in Williamsburg, so it's really exciting to have a panel devoted to the work they're doing in the publication. Before we get started, I just would like to introduce the speakers that you'll be hearing from. We've got Sam Goldman. He serves as the executive director of the John L. Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom at George Washington University, where he's the associate professor of political science, and he's also the literary editor of Modern Age. To his left, we have Dan McCarthy. He is the editor-in-chief of Modern Age, the director of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program at the Fund for American Studies. Next is Helen Andrews. She is a senior editor at The American Conservative, and Rachel Bovard, senior director of policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute. Not an editor.
Though she is in Modern Age, not forthcoming issues.
That's right. So just to get started, I thought Sam's book was particularly timely because it really discusses the question of our identity. Who are we as Americans? And several years ago in DC, when I was working there, we were organizing these regular dinners where we'd have scholars and think tank analysts and journalists come together for these dinner salons. And we actually did a dinner salon on this very topic. And the question that was presented to the group was, who are we as an American people? What binds us together? And what does it mean to be an American? And the participants, you probably would know most of the people in the room. I'm not going to mention who they were. Suffice it to say that their full-time job, they're being paid to have an answer to that question. And the question was posed to the group, and it was crickets. No one knew really how to respond. They knew maybe historically what it meant to be an American. They didn't really know what does it mean to be an American today? What constitutes our American identity? After the dinner discussion, I even asked a presidential historian the question, and he couldn't really give me an answer. So Sam's book, in some way, makes a provocative thesis that I was asking the wrong question, right? Instead, according to Sam, of searching for a mythical unity, a common denominator, or what he described as an impossible consensus, the better question, perhaps, is how do we live together peacefully in a vast modern commercial republic while maintaining the principles of personal freedom and legal equality found in our Constitution. So that is Sam's thesis, and we'll give him an opportunity to actually do a book talk, 10 minutes to summarize the core arguments of his book, which I would encourage you to purchase in ISI after the talk, and then we'll give the rest of the panelists an opportunity to respond, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So Sam, take it away.
Johnny. And before I begin, I do have a bone to pick with you,
okay.
Which is that you've set me up here with three of the most acute and devastating critics of our time, and I don't think that was really fair. So I'm upset about that. I had hoped for patsies who would praise me and my correct opinions about everything, but I think you in the audience will enjoy this conversation more. So the title of the book, as is often the case with books of this kind, is something of a tease, intended to attract your attention, but I think also susceptible to misunderstanding. So I want to begin by saying what the argument isn't before turning to what it is. And the first thing that I'm not saying in this book is that appeals to national symbols or history or rhetoric are a thing of the past. Politicians will continue to drape themselves in the flag, both literally and rhetorically, and there's nothing surprising or wrong with that. I happened to notice recently, when I was reading President Biden's inaugural address, which I hadn't actually watched, how remarkably similar it was in many passages to President Trump's address, almost word for word in the tributes to national unity and to the admirable qualities of American cooperation and so on. So I'm not saying that that is over. Nor is the book a critique of some of the policy arguments that have been associated with the revival of interest in nationalism over the last 5 or 6 years. Some of these policies with regard to trade or immigration or tech I agree with, some I disagree with, some I don't understand well enough to have an opinion on. But I think in almost every case, figures associated with the revival of nationalism have raised serious and valuable questions that command a thoughtful response. And in that respect, they've done a service. What I am saying, though, is that even if these policies or others like them were adopted, it is very unlikely that they would promote substantially greater cohesion, solidarity, or unity among the population of this republic. And one of the reasons involves the really extraordinary scale of the United States, which I think we don't think about often enough as a political challenge. The population of this country, I believe, has now passed 330 million. Which is 5 or 6 times greater than the population of the Roman Empire at its height, depending exactly how you count, and is orders of magnitude larger than the examples of more cohesive nation states that are often cited in these discussions. On the left, people often refer to Denmark or Sweden. Denmark has a population roughly comparable to that of metropolitan Phoenix. On the right, sometimes the state of Israel, which has a population comparable to that of New York City. So the United States is really a different animal to these smaller societies, and I think that needs to be taken into account. There are also recent challenges to national unity or cohesion. One is technological transformation, an issue that Rachel has studied much more extensively than I have. The other is what might be described as the identity revolution, which the first panel discussed. And that seems to have taken shape in its modern form roughly in the 1960s, but I think actually has much deeper social and cultural origins. But there are also historical challenges, and this is really the main argument of the book. I suggest that we Americans have never been as unified and as loyal to each other and common principles as we would sometimes like to think. And in particular, I describe 3 symbols or metaphors that stand for different understandings of American national identity, each of which has had moments of success and contains elements of truth, but has also historically failed to answer the question of what it means to be American. And I designate these 3 visions: covenant, which is a way of describing and understanding of the American people as a chosen nation, comparable to the biblical people of Israel; crucible or melting pot, which is associated in popular memory with the port cities of the East Coast in the early 20th century, but I try to show historically was a more Jeffersonian idea that emphasized Western expansion and the transformative consequences of an agricultural lifestyle. And finally, creed, which designates the argument that to be American is to uphold certain political and moral principles, an idea that certainly has precedence extending back into the 18th century, but that I think was fully articulated and institutionalized around the middle of the 20th century in connection with the Second World War and early Cold War. And I think that when many people today evoke a previous era of consensus and cohesion, that's really what they have in mind. So each of these moments contains elements of truth and was successful in different ways, but none worked continuously or generally. And I see American history as an ongoing process of reinvention and rediscovery in search of a sense of community that we need, but that also continually eludes us. And this raises the question of whether we might be in line for another reinvention or rediscovery. This has happened before and could conceivably happen again. And that may happen, but I think that we tend to look in the wrong place for these developments. Conversations on these issues revolve around formal education and classroom instruction. I'm just not convinced that those are the most significant formative institutions. To continue one of the themes of the weekend. And in particular, I think that if what we're talking about are narratives or stories or metaphors or visions rather than scholarly arguments, it is to creative culture that we must look for renewal rather than to textbooks and lectures. And in that respect, I think even more than in formal education, conservatives have been routed and should redouble energies. I was just talking to a film producer the other day who's trying to make a movie about George Washington. I don't know if this movie will be made. I don't know if it would be a good movie, but producing films and novels and stories and other arts that are not constrained by pedantic questions of scholarly accuracy seems to me of the highest importance and is probably a more promising avenue for renewal than endless debates about what is taught in 10th grade. I also think that any effective response has to involve the revival of the sort of mediating institutions that the first panel discussed. And those institutions, it's important to understand, will often be institutions of disagreement and dissent rather than unity or agreement. When we associate effectively with others, it's usually because we share some belief or commitment or affiliation that's limited, whether it is a church or an interest group or a particular education institution. It works because it's not for everyone and doesn't attempt to be for everyone. And I'm very critical in the book of efforts that I think are actually more characteristic of the center-left than the right, to seek a sort of wishy-washy consensus through a process of subtraction in which we ignore all the things that we genuinely disagree about, passionately so, and try to find some vague and abstract principles that we can all sign our names to but don't really care about. It's through commitment to particular ideas that are not universally shared that we actually form and shape our lives. And it's through that process that I think the kinds of citizens that we need are most likely to be produced. I also think, though, and here I'm very sympathetic to some arguments associated with the new nationalism, that in addition to encouraging the development of new and better institutions, we need to discourage and undermine existing and bad institutions. Whether we are talking about the concentrated power and in some cases monopoly power of big tech or higher education or the NGO complex, I think that is entirely appropriate to use national political power to try to break up these entities, not because they are insufficiently nationalist, but in a way because they are too nationalist and in the wrong manner. They are exercising concentrated power that interferes with the kind of institutional diversity and genuine pluralism that I cherish and think others should as well. Now, some reviewers of the book, including the author of a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal, found this conclusion unsatisfying, and this part of the book was described as dry and pessimistic, which could be a criticism, but I thought maybe it's like a martini. It's bracing. But I sincerely don't think that's true. I mean, I think this is a moment of great opportunity as the corruption of existing institutions has become undeniable, and as in many ways the experience of the pandemic and the last 18 months has opened up new possibilities for reorganizing our lives and activities in places and among people with whom we can agree, and in agreeing we can also disagree productively rather than merely shouting at each other on Twitter. So it's for you to judge whether this is an optimistic or pessimistic conclusion, but I really do think that this is a moment of possibility.
Thanks, Sam. Dan, the floor is yours.
Well, as both Sam and Johnny's opening remarks have indicated, when we talk about nationalism, we're often talking about apples and oranges. And even using the same terminology while having very different ideas in mind can make it difficult to put them all within one frame and allow us to get a common understanding. But I'm going to try to at least suggest some ways in which the use of nationalism right now as a political label does have some salience for the kinds of arguments that Sam has made in his book, which, as he has told us, is not primarily about current questions of economic nationalism or immigration or foreign policy. It's more about the overall notion of whether there should be a common identity that Americans share that has something sort of more substantial to it than might be indicated by simply nominal citizenship or what have you. And I do think that there is a challenge here where academics, especially because the academy today, even people within the relatively more humanistic side of it, they want to have a strict scientific absolute definition of concepts and of the materials that they're working upon. They don't like messiness. And so I think that when you have an academic treating something like nationalism, which is messy and which is not amenable to a simple definition, you wind up creating what would be in other contexts called straw men. And in this case, I don't think Sam has set out to do that, but I think that you get a nationalism that's a little too brittle, a little too sort of firmly aiming at one particular goal, which in Sam's case is this goal of cohesion, this goal of unity. Whereas in fact, I think if you examine the ways in which American nationalism or nationalisms have operated over the course of the last 200 years and more, you'll find that they in fact exhibit and exemplify the kind of pluralism that Sam himself is interested in defending. So take, for example, this idea of the Covenant. The Covenant is a form of nationalism which Sam traces to the New England sort of experiment in Christian republicanism with the Puritans and so forth. And Sam quite rightly points out that there are elements of this to be found in the American Revolution and in the War of 1812. But of course, the American Revolution in general is not characterized by the ideology and by the particular view of nationalism that one finds in this New England idea of Christian republicanism. Thomas Jefferson had different ideas, for example. A wide variety of Americans had nationalistic aspirations in the Revolution. Quite obviously, it was a nationalist movement, without having the formula that Sam sort of emphasizes there. Similarly with the War of 1812, a lot of the jingoes who wanted to fight the War of 1812, who wanted to invade Canada, they were actually the opposite of the New England Christian Republican types. The Christian Republicans at that point, as Sam notes in his book, they wanted to actually secede. They had things like the Hartford Convention, where they discussed the fact that they didn't like slavery and they didn't like the War of 1812, and so they wanted to break away from America. I think it's strange to call that kind of secessionism a form of American nationalism. There is a sense in which it is fair. I mean, it is a kind of nationalism of a sort. Whether it's American nationalism or Christian nationalism is perhaps more of the question to be raised. But in any event, nationalism is a complex phenomenon in all of these eras from the founding on through to today. What makes it so salient today is the fact that so many of the problems we're facing, including the problems that our intermediary institutions and our subsidiary communities are facing, are things that require some degree of national defense and national engagement. So it is the responsibility of the federal government at this point to take care of our borders, to be responsible for the integrity of citizenship. It is the responsibility, of course, of our federal government to be in charge of foreign policy. That's been the case since the Constitution was first ratified. And in questions of trade, you often see people adopt rather romantic views of the idea that you could have just purely sort of state-based or local community economies that are divorced both from the national economy and from the global economy. But that's not the case. Obviously, the global economy, the power of a consumer force like China, the power of large tech companies and others, these have the ability to overawe any local community. And if a local community is going to stand up to those kinds of foreign powers and concentrated market powers, you're going to need something like a degree of federal government power on the side of the local communities. So I do think that the Madisonian formula that sees our country as being partly national, partly federal, is the correct formula, and that there is in fact great wisdom back in the founding and in the continuation of that philosophy through to today. Sam is right that the quest for a single sort of cultural unity is always going to be elusive, but I don't know that that has to be the goal of nationalism or of people who think of themselves as nationalists. And one of the things that is especially important right now is for a kind of nationalism that will counteract anti-nationalism, that will counteract all of the identity politics and the vociferous tendencies that are being exacerbated by the American left today. If you're going to have a sense of democratic legitimacy or simply any kind of legitimacy between a government and its people, there has to be some sense of connection between the two of them. And that's not just a matter of voting, it's a matter of feeling as if you are somehow culturally represented by the people who have power over your lives. And ideally, this would be true not only of elected representatives, it would also be true of people who have enormous private power over your life as well. Corporations, for example. Corporations should have a sense of American citizenship. They should not just think of themselves as citizens of the world. I think in order to have this kind of connection between the federal government, between the administrative state, and the American people, you do have to have a sense of the American people. And you do have to have some degree of work to cultivate a degree, not a 100% Americanism, not a nationalism that is perfect cohesion, but you have to have at least a degree of defense of the existing national identity that Americans have against these vociferous tendencies, against the idea that we are simply consumers out in a global market, against the idea that we are primarily defined by our ethnic identities or by other subnational groups. Our citizenship, the heritage that we have of our politics, and the sort of unconstructed just cultural experience we have as Americans. Not an ideology, but simply a way of being. This is what nationalism should be understood as, and I think that it has enormous political salience right now. I think Sam's book is very valuable for raising important questions about nationalism, but I do think that in dismissing nationalism, as he tends to do, and being critical of the idea that you can have a mild nationalism, I think that is mistaken and, in fact, quite a dangerous conclusion.
Sam expressed some apprehension that Johnny had stacked the panel against him. So I will begin by reassuring him that there were many things in the book that I agreed with. And I think one of the wisest and most acute points that he makes in the book is that nationalism is not about agreeing on things, but about the way we disagree. And I love that because that locates the essence of American identity, not in beliefs or in ideology or even in institutions, but in practice. That it doesn't matter if we can all sign our names to some list of beliefs, as long as we are able to. It's through the act of coming together as common citizens that we forge our American identity. And this is why one of his very sound pieces of advice is that at the federal level, we really ought to rehabilitate Congress. We right now seem to be in a very toxic cycle of caring only about the executive branch and through the executive branch, the judiciary, because that's where the power is. And that actually the legislative branch, which is where this contestation happens best, that's what legislatures do, is now the weakest branch. So if we want to engage in the practice of disagreeing productively, rehabilitating the legislative branch and Congress is very high on our to-do list. And I think that that's a feasible goal and a good one that would have the good effects that Sam describes. However, I'm shocked, Sam, that whoever it was in the Wall Street Journal called you pessimistic, because if the book has any fault, it is over-optimism. And my pessimism is in the way that we disagree at a level down from the federal government, and that's the mediating institutions that Sam talked about. He said in order to have a healthy, productive nationalism, those mediating that's where it lives. That's the way we come together and disagree, that's where it happens, in civil society. And I think that right now civil society has never been weaker in American history. And there are 5 reasons why I am very pessimistic that it will ever come back. So the 5 reasons why mediating institutions are weak now is 1, crowding out by government. This is a classic conservative argument, and it was first made in the 1960s, and things haven't gotten any better since then. So at a certain point, decades of government crowding out means that we've just lost the collective muscle memory of civil society and how to do it. The second is that single-sex organizations are now effectively illegal. I think a lot of younger people don't realize that the great institutions of the 1950s that made civil society function were very frequently all male and all female. And then in the 1970s, feminist groups used anti-discrimination law to sue every private club and organization in order to admit women, which sounded nice at the time, but in the same way that men are different than women, groups of men are different than groups of women. They have different dynamics and different strengths and weaknesses. And all male groups tend to be really good at being task-oriented and have a lot of the virtues that civil society requires. And so by completely getting rid of them, that was maybe, if you were to try to revive those institutions today, it would be against the law. So that's probably a big obstacle. The third is that the national operations of civil society groups have been captured by wokeness. So your average Boy Scout leader is not himself woke. Your average Rotarian is not himself woke. But the national organization that supervises them has absolutely been captured by all the latest left-wing fashions. And when the national organization has contempt for you and your values, that makes people at the local level less inclined to be invested in these civil society organizations. So that's a huge, huge weakness. The fourth reason is that the leadership class that used to make civil society run has been decimated in much of America. One reason is meritocracy. The people who used to be, the smartest and most capable and leaderly in their small communities are now hoovered up into elite colleges and universities, and then they move to coastal cities and stay there. So they simply are not there in small town America. This is also due to changes in the economy. Somebody who owns the local grocery store is going to be a community leader in a way that the manager of the local Safeway isn't. Because the manager of the local Safeway is effectively an employee. He's not self-employed. He doesn't have his own property. He answers to somebody else. So in that way, the nationalization of a lot of commercial enterprise in America has really weakened the leadership class that we maybe depended on a lot more than we thought we did. And the fifth and final weakening factor in civil society is immigration. Now, Sam rightly highlights that civil society organizations are actually usually a very effective means of assimilation, and that it really doesn't matter if you have people from lots of different groups. When they come together in things like the Rotarians or mediating institutions or churches, whatever it is, that can be actually a really effective mechanism of integration. But the thing that makes the immigration of the last 50 years a lot more of a challenge in that rosy story than, say, the wave of immigration at the start of the century is that it doesn't work as well when the immigrants themselves do not have a cultural inheritance of civil society. In Latin America, for example, you simply don't have a tradition of these grassroots organizations because for centuries, culture there has been a lot more hierarchical. So it doesn't mean that they're any less civic-minded or they don't care about their locality, they don't care about their neighbors, but it means that when you've got a problem in your neighborhood in Mexico City, the solution, the way you go about finding a solution is not to get together with your peers and form a grassroots organization, is to find a patron who can then solve the problem for you. So without that tradition of civil society, it's a lot harder to do the work of coming together in this way. So Sam is optimistic, as I said. He thinks that American nationalism and identity has always been contested, and we've never really agreed on everything. But I worry that we may not be able to come together and forge a new American identity anew in this generation the way that we have in previous eras when American identity has been challenged or contested. So I'm just a lot more pessimistic. Hopefully somebody else can say something to cheer me up.
Rachel?
So Helen and I did not discuss our remarks before we got up here, though we did mention that women tend toward agreeableness, and in this case, I will agree with much of her conclusions, because I think the way that you just put it, which is the function of how we disagree, is so central to what I think Sam is touching on in his book. And one of the threads I think you mentioned, Sam, and that you pull on slightly later in some of the symposiums that I've read and some back and forths, is this idea of our federal institutions being unwilling or now incapable of mastering the pluralism that I think is essential to American self-government and American democracy and American identity, as has always been, I think, understood. And what I mean by this specifically is the Congress, which Helen mentioned as well. And I think, the Article I function of the Congress is to represent so much of our differences. That was the genius of our American founding, was it created the federal mechanisms for and by which people with multiple different identities and beliefs see themselves reflected in our national discourse and our national decision-making. That does not happen anymore. And by this I mean these great central questions of who we are and how we are going to live together are not debated, they are not deliberated, they are not voted upon. And in fact, in many of these cases, we as a government have chosen fiat. And what I mean by this is, if you're ever in DC in the spring and the fall, you will notice the entire city shuts down on Tuesday mornings, Wednesday mornings, and the third Monday of every month. Does anyone know why? That's when the Supreme Court announces how it has decided to rule us. And I am a great critic of the right in this case, how much we have outsourced our centralized and fundamental self-government decision-making to what I call the juristocracy, right? We have chosen to be ruled by these black-robed masters who are deciding for us very central questions to who we are. Questions of immigration, questions of abortion, questions of great cultural significance that all of us should have a say in are now handed down on us. And of course, you're going to create division and factionalism when those decisions aren't made by the people's representatives. When we do not see these questions, in their full flourishing, and there will be tremendous disagreement. That's the point. That is why we have a Congress, is to reflect that sentiment. Because I think when people see themselves and they see their ideas being given weight and consideration, regardless of whether the outcome is on their side, they have skin in the game, right? They've seen themselves as part of that collective decision making, and instead of fiat, it becomes, less consensus, but more of a consensus type of decision making. And this is really something, I think that if we do not reclaim it, will have deadly consequences. So much of what we saw on January 6th, and I do not want to take what I think is a very complex element and reduce it to something simplistic, but I think one element of it was the fact that so much of our representative self-government has a cathartic function, right? It's supposed to be a catharsis. These great, significant questions of, really fraught with emotion and so much light and heat, when they don't take place, when that catharsis is not given, people respond. And you have these terrible images of people, rushing into the Capitol. That is, I think, a consequence in a great many ways of a failure of our self-government to answer and to respond and to reflect concerns that people have at a very local and functional level. And so I really do think this question of identity cannot be solved if our self-government and our representative institution refuses to grapple with it. And they simply do not. I've talked about how I think they outsource so many of these questions to the judiciary, to the executive branch. But even very simple questions do not receive debate. I think it was the last session of the Senate had 6 amendment votes. 6. And if you go back to the Senates and the Congresses of the early 90s, 1992, 1993, it's very, 21 bills were passed in the 102nd Congress. Of those 21 bills, each bill had between 50 and 75 amendments, most of which were given to the minority party. What is interesting about that is at the end of those 21 bills, how many times do you think a filibuster was mounted? Once. And I would posit that the reason was because everybody participated in the process, right? They all had their say. They saw their priority come and be considered in the great, well of our democracy. And they said, okay, whether or not we've agreed, I've had my say. I've seen my idea considered. And there was no need for a filibuster at that point. And so I think until and if we are able to recapture that, we will still see, these divisions that become even more ingrained and entrenched in who we are. So I don't know if that's more optimistic or pessimistic, but I do think we have to recapture that Article 1 function, that representative element, or we will not be able to solve these questions of identity because they are so central to being, these questions have to be heard, and we have a system for that. That's the whole beautiful thing about this. We have a system that is designed to do this. We just have to, I think, recapture it. And I work in DC, I meet with a lot of these members of Congress, and I'm here to tell you that they are terrible. And I do not see a lot of the courage and fortitude that one will require to be the person, the Jimmy Smith in this case, that goes down and forces these questions. But maybe one day, some of you sitting here will do it for me.
Thanks, Rachel. So, Sam, before we get to questions, I'll give you a chance to respond to the comments from the panelists.
So, just briefly and in order, Dan politely but distinctly suggests that I've created sort of straw man version of nationalism that doesn't correspond well either to what's happening today or perhaps in the past. And I think to some degree that is an imperative in discussing anything. You have to have some definition or account of the phenomenon that you are talking about. But I do, in the book, particularly in the introduction, try to avoid a sort of caricatured distinction between nationalism, which is bad and evil and mean, and patriotism, which is good and virtuous. And that's the way the distinction is often drawn. Because I think, and I agree with Dan, that these words have been used in very similar and often interchangeable ways in different contexts, and looking for some trans-historical essence is not going to be successful. So here's really the distinction that I do think is important, whether you want to call it nationalism, patriotism, or something else. And it builds on one of Josh Michel's observations in the first panel. One is an understanding of American identity and membership that is based on a direct practical encounter and is in certain ways open-ended. We don't know what the result is going to be until we do it, until we live together, as opposed to an understanding of what it means to be American, which is in certain ways similar to identity politics. It's predetermined. The answer is given. You don't need to find out through this encounter and through these formative processes what it means. You just need to assert who you are. So I'm in favor of the former, and again, if it pleases you to call that nationalism, that's fine. I really don't think the terminological debate is the important thing here. Although I do wonder whether if that is what you want, whether nationalism is the right label to sell it, because fairly or not, it does have unpleasant connotations, and I'm not convinced that struggling against those rewards the efforts. As for Helen, who manages to be more depressing than I am, I mostly agree that these are challenges. My historical instinct, though, is that these are not altogether new challenges, and there have been periods in which they have been met more effectively than we seem to be doing at present. And I think that in conservative or right-of-center circles, the so-called progressive era gets a bad rap, because this is when people decided they hated the Constitution, they didn't believe in natural rights, and everything went to hell. But it was actually a period of extraordinary institutional and social innovation, which attempted to deal with some very similar phenomena. So I think there's inspiration there, even though it is impossible to transfer directly strategies or arguments that were effective in the late 19th century to today. And I think that includes immigration. I mean, I don't want to dismiss the influence of ancestral culture, but I'm not convinced that Latin American or other immigrants today are any less predisposed to civil society than, say, Southern Italians were 150 years ago. The difference is a political system that does not require, and in some cases, exactly as you and Rachel described, does not permit people to organize themselves in ways that I think would have this formative effect. So there has to be a liberation of civic energy and institutional creativity that I think requires reducing the influence of national institutions, and in particular the most concentrated institutions of national power. And that's another reason that I would hesitate descriptively to call this nationalism, even if others want to call some similar arguments or proposals by the same name. I agree entirely with Rachel, except on one important point, which connects to my defense of culture and imagination and storytelling as an element in civic life. And that's that Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is the worst possible model. This is the most pernicious image of what Congress should be, because he prevents members of Congress, members of the Senate who are engaged with their own constituents and are civic leaders in their communities from doing the business in a slightly dirty way that will deliver concrete benefits to their citizens.
It's a totally fair critique.
He has to stand on principle and demonstrate to everyone how wise and virtuous he is and how he's above compromise. So when I teach this movie to my students, I try to convince them that the corrupt Senator Payne is the true hero when Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But I have not yet succeeded.
Thanks so much, Sam. We'll now move to 15 minutes of audience questions, and we're going to start with the app. So we've got a question from Elise. To what extent has the economic growth we've experienced since the founding undermined national identity? You could also put it in the inverse: to what extent has the economic growth that we've experienced since the founding strengthened national identity, depending on which, I guess, historical period you're looking at?
Well, I mean, I'm not an economist or an economic historian, so I always recur to these vague sort of cultural categories rather than indulging in data. You know, I just don't know, and that's not really what I do. I mean, I think the issue, as I understand it, has less to do with economic growth per se than different technological and economic structures that impose different incentives. So one reason that nationalism was appealing to industry in the 19th century is that it was a way of constructing larger markets and connecting producers and consumers much more efficiently than they had previously been able to do. And one of the reasons for the decline of connection between business and the national state over the last 100 years has been exactly the same reason: the pursuit of greater efficiency, access to larger and more prosperous markets, and so on. So, you know, my instinct in all of these questions, without having a definitive answer, is to think a little bit less about ideology. And I think that intellectuals in general, but conservative intellectuals in particular, tend to overemphasize the principle that ideas have consequences. So there are these bad ideas, and we have to refute and expose them, and then we'll replace them with good ideas. And think about institutional incentives that lead different actors, whether individual citizens or members of Congress or economic entities, to behave in undesirable ways. And if we want them to behave differently, then the question is, how can we change the incentive structures that will reward them or not for doing these things? I think rather than yelling at them about how terrible they are and that they need to read more Madison, even though that would be a good thing for everyone to do.
I mean, I do think you have to consider the extent to which your society and culture, including the institutions of enculturation, the educational institutions, the schools, are promoting economic efficiency and economic integration globally as the summum bonum. I mean, if that is what it means to be a good person in the 21st century, is to be an efficient global consumer, then you're obviously going to have this tendency to destroy congressional attachments to your federal government. You're just going to think of these things as simply administrative zones for particular sets of economic regulations. If you want to counteract that, I think you do have to affirm some sort of alternative. You can't beat a horse with no horse. And one of the alternatives that you can affirm is the idea that the nation state, as something that combines economic interest with the idea of citizenship and with the idea of a historical experience, that the nation state is an alternative to simply a world of consumers, administrative jurisdictions, and vast economic powers over which no individual consumer has control.
My question was prompted by a comment Rachel made, but probably applies broadly to the discussion. I'm wondering I'm a great fan of Mark Levin, and I read his book on basically Convention of States, and was really struck by the argument that the problem with Article 1 was introduced by the 17th Amendment. To what degree is the problem that Senate races are national? I mean, I get material to donate to Ted Cruz's Senate campaign, and I used to live in Delaware. I now live in Connecticut. I should have nothing to do with Ted Cruz's Senate campaign, and yet I find myself interested in Ted Cruz's Senate campaign. But he wouldn't be asking me for money if the 17th Amendment hadn't passed. And to what degree do you think that, and possibly more broadly, Convention of States, is a direction we should be going?
Are we all on board with repealing the 17th Amendment? Consensus on that?
I think Dan isn't.
Well, I'm just skeptical that it would have the salutary effects that are imagined for it. The thing is, before the 17th Amendment came into effect, most states had already adopted sort of virtual systems of direct election of senators. And so, you know, the other thing too is I just don't know whether people are going to want to surrender that power as voters and give it back to state legislatures. It's always a hard ask to say to a voter, hey, you don't get to decide on this yourself, you have to give this to your state legislator. Even if that's, you know, a wise argument to make, it's a very hard argument to get people, you know, personally to go for.
I think also, specifically with regard to fundraising, part of the cause is, I'll assume, well-intentioned campaign finance reforms that have made it very, very difficult for the national parties to raise and distribute money. So candidates are on their own, which means they want to reach out to the largest possible network of potential donors. So I think among the institutional reforms or innovations that would be useful and are probably more plausible than repealing the 17th Amendment is enabling parties to do more of their own fundraising, which will relieve some of that pressure on candidates, and I think also will help parties function, restore their traditional function as another mediating institution, not just a brand for independent candidates, but as a coalition that can influence its members. So that seems more realistic to me. I don't think a convention of the states would be a good idea. Some of you may have seen the version of this produced by the progressive journal Democracy. They invited a number of constitutional scholars and historians to propose a new constitution, and it was an utter disaster. And I tweeted something like, the best argument for the genius of the framers is what everyone else proposes, even though it's easy to find particular elements of the Constitution that are obscure or we can imagine might be improved. I find it utterly implausible that we would do better on the whole, and I think we would almost certainly do worse.
Any other questions? Vegan?
Let me preface what I have to say with the fact that my first language wasn't English, it was Armenian. They had a grandfather that would teach Armenian immigrants English in his home and took the Webster's dictionary with him to bed. It's really significant. Language is the soil out of which culture grows. What we're doing is we're minimizing English as a language. We should not be having bilingual anything in this nation. Bilingual anything. That is a problem none of you have addressed. But in order to imagine the kind of community that you're calling for, the language itself has to be nurtured and the children have to be nurtured. That's the beginning. And the beginning is once you've begun to teach them the language in a manner in which it enhances the language, not degrades it, then you lead them immediately into the study of the culture itself, whether it's literary, arts, whatever it might be, and that has to happen very early. The last thing I have to say is the Intercollegiate Studies Institute has to make a turn. It has to pay much more attention to primary and secondary education. The university is over. They're corrupt, and they corrupt our children. And that's that. We have to give birth to new higher institutions of higher education, but we can't do that without the children. Not us. This is adult talk up here. This is not the children. The children, they say the children are our future. That's absolutely right. But it's not a future that is unguided. It has to be guided, and we're not doing it in this society. The bilingual issue is very important, immensely important. And I know I suffered it when I was in first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade. My grammar was awful. I mixed up speech. Thank God I had a mother whose father was the one who taught Armenians English. Thank God my father would bring home 5 and 6 books every other day for me to read. That's the only reason that I made it. The schools weren't helping me because the schools didn't even have any appreciation of that. We can't go back to that. But we have to understand that the language is at the source of it, the idiom through which we create culture.
So, I mean, I don't think that the data suggests that there is any crisis of English in at least the narrow conversational sense. This is pretty widely studied, and it just doesn't seem to be true that there are large populations that generationally are not speaking English and are cut off from the mainstream of American life. And ironically, that's probably partly thanks to globalization. As English has become the de facto international language, it has also been strengthened as an American language. And if I were concerned that English were endangered, I would be more worried about that. I just don't see the evidence that that's the case. Now, the problem is...
I live in Culpeper, Virginia, and you can hear Spanish being spoken everywhere. The point is that the children have to be immersed in the English language from the beginning, and they're not. They're not.
Again, this is a widely studied issue, and there's really no evidence that US-born children are not speaking English. Now, what's true is that they may not be speaking it very well, and the English they know is the English of television and the internet and popular music. So I'm less worried about the fact of English than I am in the cultivation of English as a literary language that has something to offer.
Introduce them to literature right from the start. You just
Well,
said it.
Vegan.
You learn the English language through the media. That's a disaster. Period.
With that enthusiasm, we'll move to one brief question. We have 1 minute left. Jeff Paulette, front row.
I find it kind of astonishing that all 4 of you discussed the problem of nationalism without discussing war at all.
It is a chapter in Sam's book.
Well, I haven't read the book. It was too dry and pessimistic for me. So, or worse, misguided and dangerous. I mean, that's...
It was only the conclusion that was too dry and pessimistic. The book as a whole was slim and elegant, according to this reviewer.
I mean, I think there was a moment
Much like us.
around 9/11 where there was this kind of sense of what does it mean to be an American was kind of raised with a sort of new urgency again. And I think war was offered as a solution to it, and it failed miserably. So I wonder if you could comment on whether it can be done, the kind of renewal that you're talking about can be done without war, whether the price would be worth paying in any case, and how that might relate to some kind of permanent war state or the sort of militarization of the culture.
So I do have a chapter on this in which I argue that historically war has been the forge of nations, not only for the United States, but also for other nations. And I think that has encouraged a misguided enthusiasm for international conflict as a source of cohesion, which was on vivid display 20 years ago in ways that now seem quite disturbing, knowing as we do how it turned out. I think that significant military conflict would almost certainly have the opposite effect today. And whether you are concerned for peace in itself or for issues of national cohesion and solidarity, a more restrained foreign policy is in your interest. So that's one of these issues on which, whether you want to call it nationalism or call it something else, I think that my arguments dovetail with those of some of the people that I'm disagreeing with.
Yeah, I would agree with what Sam has said. It seems to me interesting that some of the most outspoken critics of American foreign policy over the last 30-plus years have in fact been self-identified nationalists, people like Pat Buchanan. Nationalism today in America as a salient label tends to actually be much more anti-war, much more realistic and restrained in its foreign policy than liberalism and humanitarianism and a more universalistic approach to an outlook on America's role within the community of nations and so forth. It's actually liberalism that's been driving the wars of the last 30 years. And you can look at the rhetoric that President George W. Bush employed, you can look at the rhetoric of Bill Clinton. All of these things are usually not making the case for American national interests, for America as having a nationalism that has to be expressed through these conflicts. Instead, it's about universal rights that have to be championed, vindicated, and established everywhere. In Afghanistan, for example, over 20 years. And of course, one of the things we've found here is that we tried to set up parliaments and legislatures in places like Iraq, and it turns out you can't do that when you have the amount of weak nationalism that you have in a place like Iraq, because the parties are all sectarian parties or they're tribal parties. They are all so attached to some subnational unit that they just fight for their own interest within the legislature. They're not there's no sort of national identity that they can all draw upon, or at least there is a very weak one. And I don't want to see America take that same sort of path. I don't want to see identity politics and a strengthening of extreme fractionalism cause a progressive weakening of our legislative power. And traditionally what you need in order to have something that is so multicultural and so not just pluralistic but hyper-pluralistic is that you need a powerful centralized authority, a singular executive, a singular kind of emperor figure, in order to dominate that otherwise disagreeing community of just fragments that is not a nation. I think America has to avoid that fate, and in order to avoid it, we have to work seriously to strengthen the idea of the America as a nation state.
And on that note, let's give our panelists another round of applause. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Sam's book on your way out, and we're going to take.
You don't have to read it.
Just buy it. Yeah. Or you can just Venmo him cash.
Short. You can get it
Yeah. So quick 5-minute break, and then we'll be back here at 11:30 for the alumni panel.